Good afternoon. I'm Layli Mapayan, Executive Director of the Wellesley Centers for Women. On behalf of WCW and the Freedom Project, I'd like to welcome you to today's panel titled Women, Gender, and Afghanistan. As we continue to receive terrible news from Ukraine, it becomes more important than ever to discuss how war, invasion, and prolonged conflict destroys countries, human lives, and livelihoods. And of course, we know that conflict has gender dimensions. Today, our focus will be on women, gender, and conflict in Afghanistan amidst the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Before I introduce our panel and our panelists, I would like to remind you about a couple of house rules related to audience participation. This panel is being presented in webinar format, meaning that audience cameras and microphones will be off. You can feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A dialog box anytime during the panelists' presentations. Your questions will be directed to our moderator, who will in turn share them with our panelists for a discussion following their initial remarks. This panel is the result of a collaboration among several institutions. We're thankful to Scholars at Risk for inviting us to participate in the Vivian G. Prinz Scholars at Risk Speaker Series. The Wellesley Centers for Women and the Freedom Project at Wellesley College are delighted to collaborate with Tufts University's Institute for Global Leadership in this two-panel series to bring scholars and activists together to address the multidimensional implications of destabilizing global challenges for peace and security in the world. In this first panel, we address gender in Afghanistan. The second panel, presented by Tufts University at the end of April, relates to climate change and security risks. We certainly hope that you'll be able to attend both. Now for today's event. Women and girls in Afghanistan have been the focus of the international community since the early 2000s, triggered by the United States war in Afghanistan. The initial narrative of saving the Afghan woman was instrumental in the justification of the US-led military operations and the war on terror. Yet, the international feminist movement, including many Afghan women, criticized this discourse, highlighting Afghan women's agency and Afghan women's own longstanding struggle for rights in Afghanistan. 20 years later, on the heels of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan last August and the rapid return of Taliban rule, women's rights are once again at stake. So it impels us to ask, how did women in Afghanistan fight for their rights over the last 2 decades? To what extent did women's status in society change? What will happen to women's rights and to the legacy of women's activism in Afghanistan in the near and medium term? Fortunately, we have 4 speakers who will address themes related to these questions today. Let me now introduce them to you. Our first speaker will be Shaharzad Akbar, who is a fellow in human rights with Chatham House and a former chairperson for the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. Shaharzad served in such prominent positions as Deputy National Security Council on Peace and Civilian Protection and Senior Advisor to the Afghan President on High Development Councils. Between 2014 and 2017, she was Country Director for Open Society Afghanistan, a nonprofit that supports Afghan civil society and media in areas of peace building, human rights, and promoting tolerance. She was also selected by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader in 2017. Her talk today is titled Women's Rights Movement in Afghanistan and Taliban Takeover. What next? Our second speaker will be Pashtana Durrani, who is currently a visiting fellow at the Wellesley Centers for Women. She is the co-founder and managing director of Learn, a non-governmental Afghan nonprofit organization that works to expand educational opportunities in Afghanistan. Learn has educated thousands of Afghan boys, girls, and women and trained dozens of teachers in digital literacy. Pashtana is the winner of the Thalberg Foundation's Emerging Leader Award in 2021. In her talk today, she will discuss the evolution and activities of her organization, Learn. Our third speaker will be Syed Hassan Husseini, known as Akhlaq. Akhlaq was born in Bamyan, Afghanistan, but grew up and received his PhD in Tehran, Iran. After teaching in several Iranian universities, Akhlaq returned to Afghanistan and co-founded Gargistan University in Kabul, acting as its dean in Farah province in 2010. Akhlaq has published 5 books in Farsi in Iran and Afghanistan. His major volume in English is The Secular and the Sacred, Complementary and/or Conflictual, published by the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy in Washington, D.C. in 2017. With specializations in comparative philosophy, dialogue among civilizations, interreligious studies, and human and women's rights, Akhlaq teaches religion at Northern Virginia Community College and philosophy at Marymount and Coppin State Universities. His talk today is titled The Ghost of Women's Rights and Gender Equality, Lessons We Can Learn. Last but not least, Saeed Reza Kazemi is a newly minted Doctor of Philosophy with a degree in anthropology from Heidelberg University. In his doctoral study, he examined narratives and practices in an Afghan family that is transnationalized during the last quarter century. Previously, he worked as a researcher for the Afghanistan Analysts Network, an independent nonprofit policy research organization in the western city of Herat and the capital Kabul, focusing on local political contestations, peace perceptions, and cultural heritage, among other things. He is currently a visiting researcher in the Institute of Anthropology, Center for Asian and Transcultural Studies at Heidelberg University. His talk today is titled Growing into an Educated and Aspiring Woman, a case study from a Herat city suburb, Western Afghanistan, 2002 through 2021. Our panel today is moderated by my colleague, Nazan Bedarahanulu, postdoctoral fellow in political science and interim director of the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. So Nazan, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Laili, for introducing the event and introducing our panelists today. So I would like to give the floor to our speakers in the same order of the introduction. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Shaharzad Akbar, who is currently a fellow at with the Chatham House. The floor is yours, Shaharzad.
Thank you. Greetings to all. Thank you to Laili, and thank you to you, Nazan, and thank you to Wellesley Centers for Women for this platform and for this opportunity to discuss Afghanistan. I also want to thank everyone who is participating. I know a lot's happening in the world, and as an Afghan, I always appreciate when people take time to learn about Afghanistan, to engage on Afghanistan, and to share their views. Thank you for being here. I want to speak a little bit about the women's rights movement in Afghanistan, and I want to first talk a few minutes to talk about the kind of background, and then talk a little bit about what has been happening since August 15th, and then end with some questions and thoughts for what might lie ahead. I think when we think about the history of Afghanistan, especially the history of women's rights in Afghanistan, despite the fact that Afghanistan has been at the center of international attention in some ways, at least in the period of 2002 to 2021, there are still many misconceptions, particularly about human rights and women's rights movement in Afghanistan. And one of them is a historical approach to women's rights movement in Afghanistan. There's a sense that the struggle for women's participation started after the US-led intervention in the country in 2002, which is completely not true. Afghanistan had decades of struggle for women's rights and gender equality prior to the US intervention. Many, eras of progress when we had women at the minister level, cabinet level, and women at our elected bodies, and then eras of real regression, the worst of which was the first time Taliban were in power in the period of 96 to 2001. So the first thing that I think is important to establish is the fact that the struggle for gender equality in Afghanistan is not just linked to the international intervention, and it's not as recent as one might think. The second aspect is, of course, that the women's rights struggle in Afghanistan has been controversial always, and it has been politicized. It has led to fragmentation. Women's bodies, women's rights has been a battleground of sorts in one way or another in almost all the conflicts Afghanistan has had in the past 40 years. So Taliban, prior to the Mujahideen, have tried to mobilize the public and recruit fighters based on a discourse around women's rights as being something imported, something westernized, something alien. And there has always been a very heated exchange also politically on what does it mean to pursue women's rights in the context of Afghanistan, in a country that's majority Muslim, and in a country that, you know, has its own cultural context, and other factors like levels of literacy, the urban and rural populations, the differences and aspirations of people. So it has always been a controversial topic. It has been difficult, but particularly following the US intervention and the way the whole human rights discourse was utilized, instrumentalized by the US and its allies in the war on terror in Afghanistan. And the coupling of the human rights narrative with the war on terror wasn't helpful. And while on the one hand, we saw a growth in the women's movement because more girls had access to education and more families had access to media, and we had a process of social and cultural change. On the other hand, we did see kind of a growing harsh rhetoric around women's rights and human rights, and suspicion and mistrust and questions around credibility and legitimacy, precisely because any homegrown efforts were also linked with the international intervention and the ills of the international intervention in Afghanistan. So it is there is a lot of nuance there, I think, in the way that the human rights movement, and particularly women's rights movement and women's rights discourse, is perceived in Afghanistan. In the most recent history of women's rights in Afghanistan, it has actually manifested itself since 2020, I would say, or even earlier, 2019, as US Taliban talks became more concrete. Women's rights groups and the women's rights movement of Afghanistan, they manifested themselves as the most concrete constituency who had a vision for peace and the peace process. So the women's rights movement, despite its flaws, and there are many, was the only constituency in the country, non-Taliban constituency, that really had a clear vision and a clear set of demands for the peace process. They wanted a more inclusive process. They wanted a seat not only for the women around the table, but also victims of war. And the women were pushing for transparency in the process, for greater trust building, for more local peace building. So really for a whole new peace process, different than what was being played out, for more Afghan ownership and for greater role for Afghan women, but also the Afghan people in the process. And of course, this doesn't make them friends to the Taliban, who wanted a quick and dirty deal with the Americans. So we had a surge in attacks against women, particularly targeting women's rights activists. We lost comrades and friends in 2020, 2021 to assassinations that at some point had almost become a daily occurrence. It's in this context that then we had the fall of the Republic on August 15th and full takeover of Taliban. And I think maybe some elements within the Taliban were thinking, the resistance is over. The military didn't stand against us. And prior to getting to power, they had assassinated. There were enough assassinations to really create an environment of fear. Many activists had tried to leave Afghanistan, at least temporarily relocate, even before Taliban takeover. So probably there was the sense that the field is empty. However, a surprise to them, and perhaps to some of us, was the fact that the only group that continued protesting Taliban's oppression were women on the streets of Kabul, and then Mazar and Kandahar and Herat, and for several places. Women found creative ways to protest Taliban's tyranny and the whole set of policies that were being imposed that basically were trying to away all legal rights of women, particularly civil and political rights, but also social and cultural rights for women. As we see in the latest announcements, Taliban are even imposing restrictions on women's access to parks and leisure, the right to leisure. The right to work was already limited severely. The right to education, as we all know, has been limited for the Afghan women since the Taliban, Afghan girls and women since the Taliban takeover. But we saw a resistance, and the only sort of cohesive resistance, civic resistance right now to Taliban is, again, the Afghan women's movement, both inside and outside the country. Inside the country through protests, despite enforced disappearances, despite illegal abductions, despite torture, and outside the country with Afghan women organizing themselves and lobbying governments and talking to diplomats and writing about Afghanistan, or doing the kind of work that Pashtana, people like Pashtana are doing, incredible work, bringing attention and resources to Afghan women and girls, despite being outside the country. So this commitment and this energy is really a source of inspiration in a very difficult time, because I think the past few months have been some of the most difficult times for the Afghan women. Taliban's operation remains more or less unchanged compared to the first period that they took over. But what has changed is the expectations of women, I would say, across Afghanistan for their lives. In the 20 years of openness and more connection, and with internet and social media and independent media, and people sitting in their homes and watching what's happening in Turkey and Malaysia and Indonesia and other Islamic countries in the region, people's expectations and women's expectations for their lives have changed. And now Taliban are trying to take everyone back. And that's in some ways so much harder. And there is, of course, more of a pushback, but there is also greater heartbreak and sense of hopelessness and despair about what the future holds. So what does the future hold? It's really difficult for me to say with certainty what will work with Taliban, what strategies might work with them. It's clear that they want some things. They want international recognition. They want development assistance. So I do think that for anything that they want beyond humanitarian assistance, which is unconditional, there should be conditions attached, centered around human rights, particularly women's rights. There should also be a recognition in the international community that what's going on in Afghanistan is not normal. It is a gender apartheid, and it doesn't represent the views of majorities of Afghans. The ban on education does not represent the views of majority of Afghans. I do see commentary and read commentary from people who haven't been to Afghanistan in a very long time, mostly Westerners, in fact, saying that majority of Afghans did not really support girls' education. Anyway, that's not true. There are multiple yearly annual surveys. There is, also people, all of us who have worked on the ground, have visited different parts of the country, know that when it comes to girls' education, for instance, there is almost universal acceptance and investment and support. So conditional assistance when it comes to development assistance, not normalizing what's happening in Afghanistan and what's happening to women and girls in Afghanistan, and not allowing Taliban to define that as something that's supported by majority of Afghans, but upholding some standards, but also having a really critical and frank discussions and engagements with Taliban, really pushing them to engage with their own people and to protect the civic space. Because what Taliban have been doing very systematically, especially since November last year, is try to stifle any dissent, any criticism, using really brutal means to stifle the critics, including women's rights protesters, women's rights activists, while they are putting people in jail, but they also are trying to delegitimize these voices. For instance, when women were abducted in January, several Taliban members claimed that, and officials, that these women staged their own abductions because they wanted to seek asylum in an attempt to discredit and delegitimize them. Any of us who's working for women and women's rights outside Afghanistan, they try to delegitimize our work and the content of what we say by claiming that we don't represent Afghan women. So there is a full-on war, both narrative, misinformation, but also actual threats and intimidation and arrests, disappearances and killings of women's rights activists. And I think the international community should push Taliban back on this and say, why are you so afraid of your own people criticizing you? Why are you not listening to women? And kind of trying to also, in every engagement with Taliban, center women and display women's leadership, send mixed teams, ensure that delegations that engage with Taliban also comprise of women or are led by women at the international stage, and make sure that the women's rights and human rights is part of every conversation. And Afghan human rights activists are working tirelessly despite the threats to get information out about the situation on the ground, using that information in conversations with Taliban to hold them accountable, because they have the power to do so as the international community, particularly the diplomats. And I think the most important thing for me as a women's rights defender, human rights defenders, is how can we as the Afghan community really learn from some of the mistakes that we made, and draw on them to move forward with a plan for the future, knowing that Taliban or this sort of oppression will not last forever. But we have to maintain the discourse, we have to expand the movement, we have to expand our constituencies and allies inside and outside Afghanistan, because institutions may fall apart, legal frameworks might be, scratched away, as we saw in Afghanistan overnight. But movements and ideas live on, and that's what we need to invest on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaharzad, for this eye-opening presentation. It's wonderful. It's the picture is very grim, but it's also wonderful to know that women are the last bastion of resistance and the only hope for a future of democracy. So I would like to now give the floor to Pashtana Durrani, who is a visiting fellow at Wellesley Centers for Women, who also is the co-founder and the managing director of Learn. The floor is yours, Pashtana.
Thank you so much, Nazan, and thank you so much, Shaharzad, for your amazing insights. It also looks a bit weird when I call her Shaharzad, because, of course, she has been teaching it in our university for a very long time. Everything being said, and the context that we look at Afghanistan right now is totally the way Afghanistan should be looked at. The way Ms. Shaharzad has pointed out that yes, there has always been conflict when it comes to women's rights in Afghanistan, but then you also have to look at the world, that there always has been conflict around the world when it comes to women's rights. 100 years ago, the US didn't accept women's rights, right? But then eventually they did. And saying that the Taliban are just a different creature and they come from the real Afghanistan, and that women are perceived as second-class citizens, or that's how they treat women in our culture, is something dismissive and shouldn't be A, accepted, B, shouldn't be dismissed that way, because in the past 2 decades, if you see, there were girls in schools, there were women who were in offices, there were people like Shaharzad who were leading a whole commission of human rights. So this is very dismissive of the whole world to think that, okay, the way Taliban are representing the Afghan women, or Afghanistan's case right now, is the way Afghanistan it actually is. There is always conflict, but then in every other country, including the West, there are always conflicts. Apart from that, I would focus more on the current aspects and current solutions that could be put in place, because everything what Shaharzad said, I totally agree with, and that's something that I think I don't need to repeat, because I second every one of those things. Apart from that, the fact that the work that we do right now in Afghanistan, and the way I look at current situation, is the fact that we need to find solutions. We need to look at alternatives. The Taliban hold a power just because there are structures in place that they could hold the power onto. The last government, the last 2 governments, we kept on telling them one thing, that put alternatives in place when it comes to structured learning, put alternatives in place when it comes to women assembly. There are good examples of women assembly from Rwanda, from Mexico, but the government never listened, because they were all up in their own bubbles, small little bubble. Now, looking at the current situation and how we look at Afghanistan, in Afghanistan, there are two structures that we are looking at. A, there are oppressive, misogynistic men who have taken the charge and think that they know what is best for Afghanistan. But that's normally never right, because whenever men in Afghanistan think that, it always backfires after 2 to 6 years, and it has never ended well for them. So I think the Taliban are doing the same thing. What the last two governments did was alienating the current people. And by alienating the people, they are also alienating the 50%, which is the women. The women who will, the girls who will grow up to become women. They are dishonoring every one of their pride, their right, and they will end up hating Taliban just like we do right now. And that's not going to do them any favor, because they will continue talking on platforms like that. So they have to think about it strategically if they really want to be seen as legitimate owners or rulers or whatever they call themselves of Afghanistan. Apart from that, what the international community can do is, if the Taliban don't let the women travel, right? Weren't the international community in the last 3 years legitimizing the Taliban, taking them off travel sanction list and putting them on private jets and flying them around the world, including Doha, where they just held every meeting, and where their families go to schools, where their daughters go to school. So first, put them on travel sanctions. Smart sanctions should be put in place. I mean, like, the whole international community is starving the whole Afghanistan anyways, right? Why can't you put the Taliban on travel sanctions if you really want to stand in solidarity with Afghan women? Second, put countries that are financing, supporting Taliban, put them under sanctions, pressurize them, like Pakistan, China, and Iran to some extent, where these are the countries that have been actively financing, nourishing, and giving them safe houses for them to continue destroying and ruining the lives of Afghans. Why can't the world react to that? But the world won't react to that. So every time I go on Twitter and I see people standing in solidarity with us, including the UN and the special envoy for Afghan women and every one of those, tweeting doesn't do anything. You're tweeting about it and that's it. What is the action that follows? As an Afghan woman, as an Afghan, first of all, I need to know where my home is heading. My passport expires next May. And half of the day, I have anxiety about what will happen when my passport expires, because I don't want to seek asylum. So what other options do I have? Which Wellesley was nice enough to get me everything sorted. But apart from that, if someone else was in my shoes, what do we do about them? Women like us who want to travel back home, who want to work in Afghanistan, who want to continue engaging with the local communities, with their own communities. What about them? So the international community basically doesn't want to provide a platform for Afghan women. What they are good at is replacing Afghan voices with anyone who looks like us, talks like us, or is a token of some sort of publicity, where they think that they care enough about Afghan women by inviting those voices. Now, don't get me wrong. If you really want to support Afghan women, you provide the platform and let Afghan women do the talking, the women on the ground and the women who actually fled because there was an ongoing oppression right there. Apart from that, one thing we need to understand is there are a few things that could be used right now. First of all, there should be a task force in place that actually helps Afghan women navigate through the situation. Now, a task force that is actually putting Afghan women, 30 to 40 Afghan women leaders who actually navigate the situation right now. They focus on humanitarian crisis, educational crisis, human rights abuses, women rights abuses, civil rights abuses. They all should be monitored. And apart from that, they should be followed up with all these bigger bodies, all these organizations that are still active in Afghanistan, and there needs to be engagement between those women and those bodies. That's how you engage and work for Afghans. The second thing that needs to be done is there is a structure in place called school, where the Taliban think that they have the power to show to the world that either you recognize me or I stop the schooling. Well, the alternative is investing and engaging in solutions that actually work. The first one, which we at Learn, and that's what most of my work revolves around here at Wellesley, is we're engaging with Starlink to get satellites up and running in Afghanistan, so that all these school coordinates that we have provided them get free and fast internet without being controlled by the Taliban, so that girls can actually learn wherever they are. We're also working with solar panel companies and solar power companies and digital device companies to fill in that gap through different venues in Afghanistan. Of course, this is not the whole solution. And of course, I don't say that, yes, if the schooling is closed, let's just go digital, because that's not the final solution, but it's a very good alternative looking at the current situation. Right now, there are no girls in school. At least that way, there will still be girls learning in the long run. Apart from that, one thing that I think we need to understand is that Afghanistan has been seen always as a project by the international community. And that's where Afghanistan has been failed again and again. Afghanistan is not a project, it's a country. And it's a country that has been through war. It needs to take one step at a time, but also evolve with each step. Right now, I see all these people who engage with the Taliban or whitewash them or have this sort of voice in concerns, which is okay to listen to them. But then at the same time, they get all these platforms, they can engage with the White House, they can engage with the State Department, but the women who have been struggling, the women activists who are still in Afghanistan stuck, who are not allowed to flee or come on TV, are not engaged with, not given the platforms. This is where it gets very tricky for us to navigate. Who is actually standing with us and who is actually our ally as Afghan women? This needs to be navigated. Apart from that, the most important thing I think would be focusing on Afghanistan, not just as a project, just because there is a war and Afghanistan becomes another Yemen or Syria, just because the UN becomes in charge of the whole thing, and they become the government that is running the state, which is never going to be nice or pleasant, because the UN itself has like 2/3 of its money goes into its own functions. Nothing is left for Afghans. For Afghanistan, we need to focus on grassroots level solutions that actually work in Afghanistan, that actually are feasible by the community level. Yes, there are going to be challenges, but there are always challenges, even in the nicest of the places, even with the more resources, there are still always going to be challenges. Last but not the least, and I keep on saying last but not the least, but then I continue growing it up. But one thing we need to understand, if you're really an ally, and I'm not promoting Wellesley, I'm just saying, if you're really an ally to Afghan women, I left my house, my family, and I found a house, shelter, and family at Wellesley, and I'm protected. I'm not worried about where my next meal would come from or where my next paycheck would come from. I still am able to engage back home. I'm still being able to expand to Farah, Takhar, Bamiyan, Mazar, Helmand, Kandahar, and Kabul, because I got a home, I got a salary, and I also got a shelter and a supportive community that is actually dedicated to Afghanistan. So when you are actually dedicated to Afghanistan, you give women that space so that they can give back to their community, so that they can work back for their families and for their communities and for their country, and they engage in the most easy and feasible way possible. Just tweeting about it, just saying a few words and not actually working on it doesn't mean anything. Hollow words have been said all across the universe about Afghanistan, but it has never impacted. But the impact that an Afghan woman can make for Afghan girls right now is different from that of anyone else can do it. So the best allyship for Afghan women right now would be give them the space, the support that they need to go back, give back to their communities, to support their communities, their families, their loved ones, but also their country in general, because all these women that we see, they're fierce women. They have fought misogyny, sexism, racism, and different sort of levels of abuse just to be there, just to be that person. So it's very important for us not only to recognize that, but support it in practical terms. And I'll end it here.
Thank you very much, Pashtana, for this very engaging, for your very engaging remarks. You are, and learn, your organization you are the living example of how grassroots level solutions can work. And both you and Shaharzad, thank you for continuing to be the voice of Afghan women abroad and letting us know about the struggles that Afghan women go through. I would now like to turn to Syed Hassan Husseini Aklah, who is currently teaching philosophy at Marymount University and Coppin State University. He is going to talk about the ghost of women's rights and gender equality, lessons we can learn. The floor is yours, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I would like to share my screen and go from, yes. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed the insight that I heard, and I would like to contribute to the discussion from a different perspective because of my background in philosophy and religious studies, and also my work in Afghanistan. I would like to go to another aspect of the issue. So, okay. So the question that I'm addressing is the situation that right now we see in Afghanistan. I believe this situation that we see a lot of limitation, a lot of severe attack by Taliban, the women rights, girls' education, and whole people in Afghanistan is rooted in many things. Part of that is a failure of the good project and good activism in women rights in Afghanistan and gender equality issues. So that's an example that I want to give you that came from that came from the report from Human Rights Watch on 2017 is saying in the most optimistic statistic. So the girls who went in school in Afghanistan had never gone much above 50%. So a lot of work done in Afghanistan, but still a lot of girls were far from education. And in another quote, it says 2/3 of Afghan girls do not go to school. And in 2017, that predicted that maybe there will be a reverse. And so my question is that what was wrong in strategy and in plans for advocating women's rights and gender equality in Afghanistan? Of course, they have done a lot of things, and we are aware of that, and we actually acknowledge and support all of them. But because we want to learn from our flaws and shortcomings, so I focus on this question: why a partial and fragile achievement that by the government of the Taliban, everything's disappear? So I highlight 5 things or 5 reasons that I think they were very important, and we have to keep them in mind for future activism. First of all, gender equality was kind of the strange terminology and concept in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, no Dari or Pashto translation of the gender is done in Afghanistan. So people, ordinary people, here I am talking about grassroots, not just talk about the that. So the ordinary people of Afghanistan, mostly were not be able to connect themselves to gender because it was a foreigner term in neighboring country like Iran, Turkey, and like that. They translated in Afghanistan, even they didn't try to translate it. It's not like a phone or computer or some hardware that you use the same word when you are working with some intellectual case, with something cultural related to the real experience that changed the life of people. I think we need a language to connect people. So many people who start working in Afghanistan to promote gender equality and women's rights, they appear like a savior. They look at people, they try to do some kind of top-down reform. I will tell you more about that. So most activities were focused on large cities, on urban areas, and so they were kind of the Orientalist and imperialist approach to say people, okay, I brought a saving idea. If you attach this idea, all problem will be solved. So, and even they had no any kind of the any kind of the domestic understanding of the issue, or they were less done about that. So mostly the linguistic, historical, and religious background were missed. I just put this picture that's at the tomb of a Shaharzad, a great lady who was chief consort of the Shah Rukh. So just telling that there were a lot of great women in history of Afghanistan who were active in politics, active in the culture, in creating madrasa and like that, but mostly they were not highlighted in this situation, and the concept of the gender and women's right imported like a foreigner a souvenir or something that came from other world. So because of that, I highlighted a quote from Antonio Donini, who was director of the UN Office for the Coordination of the Humanitarian Assistance in Afghanistan, who said there was a significant level of Afghan alienation toward humanitarian aid community and development process. It's before even the intellectual concept of the woman right or a gender things, even with regard to humanitarian aid community. And he in 2006 concluded that this kind of the approach in Afghanistan concluded 3 Ds: this illusionment, this empowerment, and this engagement among Afghan people. They think it's not part of their culture, it's not part of their needs, it's not part of their dreams, not part of their things. So that's the one thing that I just wanted to highlight as something that we pay less attention to that. The second thing that I would like to say, particularly with regard to gender study and women right activities. So a dualistic mindset was dominant. So I'm not saying that people had that mind, but that appeared in this way, that women rights activity was against men right or female versus male. So I, as a scholar of the human rights and women's rights, I believe that women's rights and human rights is something to unite people for common cause, to reduce suffering of people, not to divide people. But in the way that it happened in Afghanistan, so it in some extension divided people and saying, okay, if you are a woman, so you have to look and be careful of this man. Yes, in some way, in the context of Afghanistan, we tried less to improve human agency. Instead of the trying to improving woman agency, we mostly try to accuse the other gender and saying, okay, that's the problem. If you get rid of that problem, everything is solved. So that's I know it's radical say, but just to pay attention to that, I'm saying sometimes we put a gender identity before humanity. And because we didn't try to understand and show respect to humanity, we were not successful to as we wanted, as was expected to contribute to gender equality. So in some way, there was a kind of Marxist viewpoint of the dividing people into two groups: oppressed people who were females and oppressor who were males. So if you, and that actually divided society. And more than that, I think it didn't help people. Of course, women, they didn't think like that, but that mindset was kind of obstacle to promote women rights activities. The third thing that is somewhere related to the first point is ignoring Islamic examples that I think were very helpful. As I just told you, even people didn't translate gender into Dari and into Pashto, that people think it's a part of their needs, their culture, their mindset. It looks like some completely something weird, stranger, and in reality, even when we wanted to promote it, we didn't try to find some helps and some aids from our own culture. It was like a black white and saying, okay, this is the whole traditionalism is something black. We have to get rid of that. And even we ignored, for example, the huge capacity was there in jurisprudence. In Afghanistan, the majority of Muslims are Hanafi, and Hanafi school is called in Arabic Ahlul Ray, or advocates of a common sense, meaning that they put a lot of focus on opinion or new deduction, new achievement in Sharia law, and like that. They are not like Wahhabi, like many other schools. They are textualists and saying, no, this is Hadith, this is the Quran, we have to do that. Hanafi is a very liberal school among 5 schools of the Sharia and Islam. But the woman rights activist and gender studies scholar tried less to find some help from this culture, particularly in a context of Afghanistan, that people were religious, and Taliban, the opposing side, were equipped with Hanafi in a radical understanding. Another example of this ignorance is that, so in among 5 schools of the Sharia, the only school of Sharia that allow female to act as judge is Hanafi school. And when I look, even there were a lot of things in a lot of discussion, but among them, very few of them, they saying, okay, there is a justification, there is a support for that in our own religious context. We just ignore them, and we talk about gender studies and woman rights like something external, and it didn't help to promote that. We ignore the historical context of Islam. I'm focusing on that because the majority of Afghans are Muslim, practicing Muslim, and so if we talk to some people, of course, it's good to have a common language, common culture, common and shared views. So I heard a little about the people who emphasize on ladies who were around Prophet, who were very involved in some way that could help women to go and educate, to participate in business, in politics, in public life, and all other things. Khadija was businesswoman. Salma, it's a very interesting figure that nobody I heard talk about that was with the Prophet Muhammad, who actually accompanied him in battlefield, was among the ladies who immigrate from Mecca to Ethiopia, and also he is reason of some revelation, some part of the Quran, and very controversial aspects of the Quran. He even once, in some way, questioned Prophet Muhammad and the revelation, why there is not verses in the Quran about ladies, about faithful ladies, and why female immigrants are not mentioned in the Quran, and why even faithful female are not praised in the Quran. And then verses of Quran revealed after that to respond to her criticism or her question. So these were contexts that nobody pay attention to them. I'm saying, okay, if we saying we are part of this culture has some potentials to question, to open the way for public life to grow in society, and other examples that I just put their names here. We have no time to go into detail. Aisha, Fatima, Zainab, all of them in some way were involved in rebellious movement, or at least giving talks against the Caliph of Islam, the righteous Caliph of Islam, that in some way Khulafa or Rashidin are very, very important in Islamic context. But we had ladies who talk against them, or even participated in war against them, and nobody told them they are ladies, they are not allowed to participate in public life or in war or in politics or in something like that. But unfortunately, we ignored this kind of the context and just tried to spread the word with Western terminology and Western mindset. That's what I do. And even not the old time, but even modern time, I heard less that we emphasize on the accomplishment and achievement that in Muslim majority countries women did. So we didn't try to look at them and highlight them as a role model for Afghan women. Mostly the Western ones were highlighted. So I gave some example here. And one thing that I think we lacked it, and it was a big mistake. We didn't try to create kind of the Muslim feminist who can rely on the culture, but still work and fight for women's rights, for gender equality. So that's one point that I wanted to make. The first things that I think contributed to this problem is politicized activism, radical activism, and sometimes rapid demands and activism. So we forgot that Afghanistan was a kind of a wounded society for more than 2 decades, suffering and imbalance. So that's the metaphor I would like to use. If you go to this kind of country, you are like a person who approaching a patient. So you have to consider their situation, assess their situation, their needs, and we cannot do everything with a patient. So we forgot this point. I think we was very, very eager to just to do some things, and because of that we forgot to make a priority and prioritize some things and focus on that. Even we messed up the true needs and imagined needs. I know somebody maybe think of the hierarchy of needs and a lot of controversy about that. But however, if somebody can have no access to water, have no access to a school, have no access to very, very primitive things, how we can encourage them for something very far to reach? For example, we focus on political aspects so much, but we forget some kind that was related to everyday life. I'm saying we try to have members in parliament, women ministers, but I haven't heard that people focus on having ladies as a community leading members, mosque leading teams. So unfortunately, civil rights activists work less on that. And we just left mosques that play big role in a traditional society like Afghanistan. We left it to Taliban. So they just got it, but we didn't try to encourage ladies to go and to the mosque and be part of the leading team and members. We tried less about rural population. So Afghanistan is a rural country. In 2001, 79% of that, and in 2020, 74% of that. And for rural population, we need a terminology, a strategy, plans to work for them, to make sense to them, not some idea that they think it's like a strange things. We work less about many people who were displaced in Afghanistan. In 2009, we had, in 2020, we had 3.5 million people displaced. And I saw less women rights activists, human rights activists, and all these kind of people talking about these people. They were just concerned with urban new class people and their desire to be part of the globalization. That is good, that's totally fine. But what about 75% of the people? What about the people who 3.5 million people who just lost their homes and their schools and everything? We did less about disabled people, vulnerable people who were, so we focus on a kind of the political and even I would like to say abstract idea than what works for ordinary people. And because of that, we were not very able to spread the word. And the last thing, but not least, I would like to say, most of our project and focus was kind of the quantitative project to just give numbers and aesthetics and say, okay, we done it, we want to do it, and just create numbers. So we reduce the whole project to kind of the quantitative project. And as Pashtana told very good, we changed the process to kind of project to sell. And because of that, we were not very able to connect as much as people we needed, as much as funds and supports that we had to spread and contribute to the situation. This is I would like to end it with a quote that just today I saw by an Afghan and gender equality expert who published it in her LinkedIn. She says, in 20 years, we funded fashion shows, stage boarding, maintaining orchestras, guitar playing, football for women. We didn't help them get the political and professional clout to be immovable from the public sphere. So these are the lessons that I think we need to pay attention, and I hope in future we consider them. Thank you very much.
Syed, can you please unshare your screen?
Yeah, I'm trying to do it. Just give me a second. Is it done, or still you have?
No, we're still. I think I was able to do it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry for that.
Thank you very much, Syed Akbar, for sharing your insights about, if I would say, the Islamic roots of women's rights that could be applicable to the case of Afghanistan. And I'm sure you will receive many questions about self-critique and self-reflection towards Afghan men and their role in this decadence of women's rights in Afghanistan. So now I would like to move to Sayed Reza Kazemi, who is currently a visiting researcher in the Institute of Anthropology, Center for Asian and Transcultural Studies at Heidelberg University. The floor is yours, Reza.
Thank you very much. Without any further delay, I just go to my presentation and try to be as quick as possible. Yes, I will be focusing on one case study from a semi-rural area in Herat province in Western Afghanistan, and have a look at how in this particular case, a girl aged 6 years old in 2002 grew into an educated and aspiring woman by 2021. It is an ethnographic case study based on intermittent informal conversations and observations, which I did over 3 years. I focus, as I said, on the life of a pseudonym here, Roya, who was a last year female student of Herat University in 2021, before the Taliban takeover. I have a look at her life in the family, parents and siblings, in the local community, in that village or Shaharak, and then in the broader society. And then I will try to draw some conclusions about gender in and around Herat, which is Afghanistan's third largest city, and possibly across the country in the period 2002 to 2021. Although the focus here is on the example of Roya and her peers, they are just some of the tens of thousands of women and men in universities and other higher education institutes in cities in Afghanistan. And we should keep in mind that many of them come from villages and small towns. For example, in Herat University alone, in 2018, 2019, there were some 7,300 female students, 48% of entire student population, including lecturers there as well. And women constituted over half of all 11,000 applicants who took the university entrance test, known as concours, in May 2021, before the Taliban takeover. So I'm just trying to use this case study to have a look at gender. What happened in Afghanistan, in Herat? Some background on Roya's family. They returned from neighboring Iran in 2002, just a year after the US-led coalition toppled Taliban. They had fled to Iran in the 1980s during Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. They identified themselves as Shia Sayyids from central Afghanistan. The father in this family has never had a fixed job, often a daily wage construction worker. And the mother, who had some literacy, managed to find a job as a local school teacher. And they had 3 daughters and 1 son. One of them we focus here. And they bought a piece of land, built a simple house in an informal settlement, some 15 kilometers distant from Herat city. When they returned, Roya was just 6 years old. he began a school. She began a school in 2002, and then continued her studies and also her siblings. And finally, she was accepted, qualified as a medicine student in Herat University in 2014. So that's some background to know this family, which is in a way representative of many Afghan families. Afghan families, I think you rarely come across an Afghan family who has not migrated during whatever has happened in Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion, the communist government, the so-called Mujahideen government, the first Taliban emirate, the US-led intervention, and then the Taliban takeover. So it's in a way representative of many families in Afghanistan. But around 2018, things started changing for Roya's family. The father was often without work, and he used to go to such city squares. We have a picture here to look for work. And unemployment was a broader trend by 2000, even earlier than 2018. The brother, Roya's brother, who was 15 years old, was also causing some distress for the family. He was aspiring to live abroad, did not take much interest in school and was close to dropping out. And as far as the rest of the family saw it, he was spending more and more time with his friends, which the rest of the family called bad friends. And security was deteriorating. Even it was spreading to the village they were living. And they witnessed a close incident. A female relative of Roya, who was a mother and a school teacher, was killed in a roadside bomb explosion on the same road Roya was going from the village to the university. So there was a lot of discussion, angry argumentation in the family about what to do. And it took them over a year to make a decision. So much was changing for them in their local community, in Afghanistan as a whole. In early 2019, the family decided that it's better for us to leave again from Afghanistan, which they did with much difficulty. But Roya stayed to complete her studies. And here again, we should keep in mind that out-migration was a much broader pattern in Afghanistan since 2014. But this separation, Roya is staying on her own and the rest of the family leaving Afghanistan, was deeply unsettling and painful for Roya and all other family members. So what happened was that, where does Roya stay now? The family rented out their house to finance living for Iran, but where does Roya stay? Is there any room for a lone woman in communities in Afghanistan? She went through different living arrangements. By late 2021, she went to live with her aunt, elder married sister. Aunt's family left too, and she never, as she expressly stated, she was never at home. The family then struggled to get their house back, and the grandfather was asked to keep company at night, but then grandfather stopped coming because winter came, and in Afghanistan, it's very difficult for people to keep their house warm in the winter. We don't have public gas supply, electricity is not reliable. and we don't have a good fuel supply. But Roya did not give in to the pressure to leave the family house, because there was some opposition from relatives and some hurtful commentary from some people in the local community that why should she stay on her own in a house. So it was not just a house that was at stake, the social space that the house provided. And culturally, it is inappropriate for any person, whether man or woman, to live on their own in Afghanistan. And then she lived as if she was invisible to avoid not to attract or overhear unkind commentary from people. And there was, as I said, opposition to her independent living arrangement. Now, what happened in the society? So that was the family, the local community, and the society. She was one of about 60 students, roughly half women, who successfully graduated in 2021 before the Taliban takeover. And they went to different directions. Some became lecturers in Herat University. Some started their own or joined private family practices. Some found work in public or private health centers. Some pursued further education or planned to do that. And in Roya's case specifically, she became an intern in some health centers, then found part-time job with meager pay, but she was struggling to find a better paid job. Peer socialization. This is important because university is the only place in Afghanistan where you get to meet people from other provinces of Afghanistan. You study in the same place with women before the Taliban takeover, and Roya had peers. And this socialization is important because they become aware about different lifestyles, opportunities to go outside the country, to do something inside the country. But everyone was trying to find a way to get out of Afghanistan. In Roya's words, before something happens, like getting killed in the blind war. And in the society, Roya and her peers were part of an emerging female generation, not only in urban Afghanistan. I think the rural Afghanistan, semi-rural Afghanistan at least, they were such women who struggled on their own and for the not only women but also men in Afghanistan. So she's an example of these many other women, and they were very careful with society, very tolerant of the society, and other women who did not want the lifestyles that they chose for themselves. At the same time, there were reactions, not only from the Taliban, also from parts of the Afghan society who opposed even a slightly higher, let alone equal status for women, and the efforts were to control how you clothe yourself, how you behave yourself, even whether you're allowed to be present in the public sphere. And you see, for example, an example in the picture, the reaction to women and peace in Afghanistan. Some concluding remarks. Roya's story shows tensions over gender norms in society. And I think Afghanistan is not a unique context. frozen in time and space. Roya managed, and other women that Roya represented managed to make a decision to study, to try to find a work, make an income, however meager, and thus they themselves empowered themselves to do so, but often in very tense ways and with difficult trade-offs. For example, she was left on her own while the family had to leave. Or the reactions from the local community to whether she's allowed to live in their own family house or to work and be present in the society and contribute their skills as medical graduates, which the society obviously needs. But then the problem is that the broader constitutional framework protecting fundamental rights was overthrown by the Taliban. And thus the links among the macro, meso, and micro, the society, the community, the individuals, these links were re-concretized. And because they are now treated as dependent humans or lower humans, or even worse, subhumans, women and other people, for example, minorities, have lost the most under Taliban second emirate. Thank you very much. I stop here.
Reza, can you please unshare your screen, or let me try to do it for you?
Okay.
Yes, I think I was able to do it. Thank you very much for sharing Roya's story with us. It's as you said, this has been the fate of many more women from Afghanistan, and it's very interesting to see all these ups and downs in their lives. There are definitely many layers to the current state of patriarchy and the repression over women's rights, and the ethnographic story you shared definitely highlighted many of them. So now I would like to move on to questions from the audience and direct them to our panelists. While I'm directing the questions we received so far, I would like to remind you that you can use the Q&A module to ask your questions to the audience, and I would be more than happy to narrate them for our panelists to reply. So our first question and comment is for Shaharzad and Pashtana. I will just read it. Shaharzad Akbar and Pashtana Durrani, what words of warning do you have for the impact of Taliban eventually to the lives of women in the West? Also, the question poser is pleased to see your strong voices represented here. So Shaharzad or Pashtana, Shaharzad, if you would like to go first.
Sure, thank you, Nazan, and thank you, Mina John, for participating and for that question and for all the work that you do for Afghans, particularly Afghan women. I think the situation in Afghanistan is really a test for human rights movement and for feminist solidarity. It's a test case. What's happening in Afghanistan is so intolerable, and the fact that it's happening in 2022, and if Taliban managed to get away with it, which they are so far, I think it really raises a lot of questions about what feminist solidarity means and to what extent the feminist movement is strong, particularly the feminist movement in the West, and able to stand in solidarity with Afghan women. But also this sort of normalization of the gender apartheid in Afghanistan. If Taliban can get away and get a recognition despite their restrictions on women, then it, of course, sends a message to women all over the world that despite all our progress, everything that we have attained is so fragile. It's so breakable, and that we should all be trying to do more and not take anything for granted anywhere. I mean, we already see so globally that the women's rights movement is under attack. It is under pressure. Some of the discussions in the US happening around, for instance, abortion, reproductive rights, is just a reminder of the fact that there is nowhere where we have attained full gender equality. But I do think that if Taliban continue to get away in the way with what they are implementing against women in the way that they are currently, then it would be a very, very humbling moment for the feminist movement everywhere, particularly the West.
Thank you, Shaharzad. Pashtana, would you like to chime in here to address this question?
I think what Shaharzad just said is what needs to be looked at from every perspective, and exactly what needs to be seen in Afghanistan. It's a challenging time for Afghan women, but also for Afghan women rights movement at the moment. So one can do a lot of things, but at the same time, standing with Afghan women in solidarity, doing something for Afghan women is what matters at the moment. People can do the follow-ups later. At the moment, we just need people to actually, if not fight with us the way we are fighting, at least stand at least in those pragmatic grounds. Yeah.
Thank you both. I would like to pose a follow-up question on this one, because you both mentioned in your initial remarks, and now you provided very concrete examples about what can be done and how the international community can both pressure Taliban regime and also support women and women's rights movements in Afghanistan. With regard to solidarity from the international feminist movement, I was wondering whether civil society to civil society connections could be formed and maintained. How viable is this for women's rights movement in Afghanistan? I'm also thinking of security concerns, and how can these movements learn from each other? Apparently, the only hope we have is grounded power that women can build up. So how can we form these kinds of civil society connections? And I'm thinking like there are a lot of internationally acclaimed women's rights movements around the world, from Sudan to Kurdistan, who receive a lot of attention. But then again, when it comes to concrete contributions, things just stay at the lip service level. So I was wondering what kind of concrete solutions you might have for this kind of solidarity building.
Thank you, Nazwan. I think one thing that civil society can do, particularly civil society in Islamic countries and women's rights movement in Islamic countries, is to continuously remind their governments about the situation in Afghanistan and to continuously pressure their leaders to stand an objection to Taliban's gender apartheid in any way they can. But also they themselves regularly take any opportunity, 8th March, the 25th November, any occasion to actually remind people about what's going on in Afghanistan, what women, and create platforms where Afghan women from inside and outside Afghanistan can speak about the situation. I think one important thing is to not forget the situation, because forgetting then leads to normalization. But then also global women who are in positions of leadership in both private and public sector and countries across the world who claim to believe in and promote a feminist agenda, they have a responsibility towards the situation of women in Afghanistan as well. And they should be using their power and leverage in any way they can, from what's happening. Universities are, for instance, opening spaces for Afghan women. Institutions are drawing on Afghan women's expertise. See them as agents, as contributors, as people who can enrich your institutions, who can enrich your work, and draw on their expertise to not only expect Afghan women to work on Afghanistan, but also draw on their expertise on how to do better work in other contexts. I think this is important, to see them as assets. This will remain really important. One of the regrets that I have about my own work was that my work individually as well, because I studied in the West, and I interacted a lot with fellow scholars and activists from the Western countries. We really didn't have a South focus, and didn't try to build strong connections in the region and in other Islamic countries, but also more broadly in more countries in the South. So that's an area that I'll try to reach out and try to learn more. And that's where I really do hope also that we will see kind of more collaboration and more partnership in terms of doing joint projects, thinking through the questions together, thinking through solutions together. Of course, every context is different, but what are some of the lessons that we can learn from women in Latin America, in many African countries, and Middle East? Those are some of the immediate areas that come to mind. But women should also be the force to really stop Taliban's recognition and normalization, unless Taliban change their policies on women's rights in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Shaharzad. Pashtana, would you like to weigh in here?
I'd just like to add two further points, like apart from what Shaharzad said, that yes, there are expertise on Afghan women, not only focusing on Afghanistan, but on as in assets. They are much better at, because they have been in conflict and they have worked in conflict for so long that they might understand a thing or two more than the people in the West do. Apart from that, we need to look at models. Model for Rwanda, I think the assembly for women in Rwanda, I think that was the best example for us, how women assemble themselves and stay in assemblies. I think that's the best thing that would have that we could have more modeled, or we could model in other countries like us in the MENA region, in the African regions, or especially in these Muslim country regions, especially in Central Asian countries. That's something that could be focused on. Apart from that, there needs to be network development that's more civil society based rather than governments coming together. I mean, like, it's very normal for the Qatar foreign minister, who's a woman, can talk to the Taliban, but then there is no civil society engagement from Afghanistan with Qatar so that they can talk about their own policies and talk about more in-depth or conversation or engagements. That needs to be done. I think one thing, a shout out to people in Kurdish regions. I think the women are the force of nature in those regions, and they have been fighting for good, and they have been fighting in the forefront. For me, that's respectful, and I think Afghan women can learn a lot from them. There's this sort of learning process that goes around in these regions. There could be a huge learning opportunities between women of Bangladesh, women of the Kurdish region, and especially women of all these and women of Afghanistan who have come across different political conflict and economical layers of conflicts, and they could teach us a thing or two, especially in the West that always funds projects but never actually listens to what the suggestions are.
Thank you very much, Pashtana. There is another question from the audience that I would like to ask. What is the present situation with child marriage in Afghanistan? It's not directed particularly to anyone, so if any of our panelists would like to address this question, please feel free to turn on your camera.
Just briefly, I think one thing that we didn't really talk about enough in this discussion was the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. As you all know, the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is quite dire. And there are unprecedented levels of poverty and starvation, unprecedented in the past 20 years at least. This has, of course, contributed and led to an increase in child marriages, unfortunately. And the humanitarian situation while there is some attention to the humanitarian situation, we can't really get out. Afghanistan can't really get out of this devastating situation unless there's also thought put into the economic situation and creating some space for economic activity. Some of the recent US exemptions have been helpful with that, but we also need to see both Taliban and the US doing more to return liquidity to the market. And there is sometimes this discussion of, okay, if there is any opening up more space for banking and for economic liquidity, does that mean kind of sending the money through the Taliban? Not necessarily. Other solutions have been proposed, other technical solutions that would allow some liquidity to return to Afghanistan without necessarily money going directly to Taliban, or with minimizing the risk of the money going to Taliban. And I think that's where we need to move the conversation now. If next year and the year after that, we're still talking about these levels of humanitarian aid, then we have all failed collectively, the international community and the human rights community, because humanitarian situation and human rights is directly connected and interlinked. People's economic rights are being withheld. Afghans are starving, and this is leading to a range of human rights violations, including an increase in child marriages. Of course, it also doesn't help that the Taliban's views and practices on the rights of girls and women vary greatly from universal standards and from Afghanistan's universal human rights commitments. For them, they don't see child marriage as a problem. They don't define that as a problem. So that also is another enabling factor.
Thank you, Shaharzad. Reza, if you would like to say a couple of words on this, please feel free.
Yes, I just want to add one point to what Shaharzad was saying, and that is the issue of fear and insecurity. That's one thing, and the problems that the Taliban are creating for education and higher education for girls, women, higher education, also problems for men that the Taliban are creating. So if they really decide or stay on their decision to keep schools closed to girls after the 6th grade and to maintain or reinforce gender separation in the universities, in addition to this feeling of anxiety, fear, and insecurity that families have, and that is in a way particularly affecting girls and women, I think that also puts many families in a situation that you'd better marry off your girls sooner rather than later, because there aren't schools there, there aren't universities there, there is no point in studying. At the same time, in the villages of which we are less and less aware, because reporting out of Afghanistan, independent reporting out of Afghanistan is increasingly controlled, censored, and suppressed. Then there is the point of insecurity. We don't know how the Taliban foot soldiers behave. We don't know if there are other players who will make problems or insecurity for people, local people in the villages. I think this affects the decision-making of many families, that under such circumstances, you're put in a situation that it's better to hasten the marriage of your girls or daughters or boys.
Thank you, Reza. Our next question will come from Leyli Maparian. I would like to invite her to ask the question herself. And I also would like to remind you that we planned the event to end around 2:15. So maybe after Leyli's question, I can receive one more question. So if you would like to pose another question, this is the right time to do it. Leyli, please.
Thank you, Nizan. I really wanted to, thank today's speakers for the really illuminating remarks that they've made in their individual presentations. And what I was really struck by is some of the connecting threads that I observed in the talks, and I wanted to ask them about some of those things. For example, one of the things that really occurred to me while I was listening to all three, actually all four presentations, was the need to really decolonize our approaches to activism and allyship, as well as our notions and actions around post-conflict reconstruction. And, listening to perspectives that really highlighted not only, for example, Islamic perspectives, but also diverse Afghan cultural perspectives and secular perspectives that are coming out of Afghan contexts. I think that Pashtana made a comment during her remarks where she said Afghanistan is not a project, it's a country. It really reminded us the way that sometimes the global discourse and the global community and the global political actors treat the situation. And this was really highlighted for me because I just came from Liberia, which, as many people know, is a West African nation that also had a really long conflict history. And now, 2 decades later, is still struggling through its post-conflict reconstruction with everything that entails, including the gender issues. And so I'm thinking, about Global South cross-fertilization, which someone briefly mentioned. And I'm just wondering, with all of our speakers today, what would sort of be their top 3 wish lists if they were to think about how we move forward collaboratively into Afghanistan's next phase? When you think about outside actors and how people are engaging, people who, like my Hubi sitting in this audience today, if you could just really crystallize what would be the best way to move forward together, taking these common threads into consideration.
Maybe we can go in the reverse order this time. Pashtana, would you like to?
I think I like that. So thank you, Leyli, for the question. I think for me, the first 3 things, if they were on my wish list, and especially when it comes to decolonizing the whole activism in Afghanistan and women rights. People think that women rights were introduced in Afghanistan post 2001, which is very funny for me because every time I tell them that we had a women education minister 100 years ago, where women didn't have even voting rights here. So it's very different to negotiate or tell the history, especially when they see you as victim. For me, those 3 things first would be building alternatives to learning, structured learning, and certifying them. So not only girls in Afghanistan, but girls all over these regions where they have been in conflict or might come under conflict, be it Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, or any other country comes under conflict, especially, is able to access learning in their own native languages without losing their touch with their own culture, their own roots, continue learning, but through alternative means. Technology is at that phase where we can make that happen. That would be the first thing. Accessible learning, free learning, and most importantly, something that's connected to your roots, not something that's westernized. Second thing would be a platform where Afghan women from each province, for me, would be, as an Afghan woman, from each province gets their capacity built so that they could do their own talking, they could voice in their own concerns rather than people, especially men, talking on their behalf. That's something that I would really want to see in the long run, and them representing, but also pointing out on projects like, okay, if a need a well, the women of the village needs to have that ask. That's how you make women decision makers. Last but not the least, a network that is focused more on peace building rather than making it a more storytelling, or not that I'm against storytelling, it's a good thing. And that's what Shaharzad said, if you don't tell, you forget. But at the same time, this so 6 months ago, Afghanistan was in the highlights, but now people don't care. I think the last but not the least, a network, a support structure needs to be put in place for any country that's undergoing a conflict, that could actually provide a task force of those people who are from the intelligentsia, from the academia, who are actually invested in those countries and have solutions that could make an impact. So for me, those three things will be very important. Thank you.
Please go on, Reza.
Yes, the first thing for me, as you said, is that I think the experience of the last 20 years in Afghanistan has shown how devastatingly all our theories and models have failed in Afghanistan. I think that's so it's, for me, the first thing is how not to go forward. Because maybe by going forward from outside, you may end up putting people at risk, putting women or men at risk. So it's very difficult for me, very complex, how you could do something for Afghanistan under Taliban second emirate from outside. So that's very difficult. But one thing, maybe two other points. The first one, this pressure on the Taliban to soften their policies is very, very important. No one else can bring the Taliban to answer. The pressure from the international community, but the unfortunate problem is that the parts of the international community that right now have enormous influence on the Taliban, China, Pakistan, Iran, and other neighboring countries, they don't care about fundamental rights in Afghanistan. This is my understanding. They don't talk about the Taliban, to the Taliban about this issue. At least I have not heard, maybe I'm wrong, but the rest of the international, particularly the UN, has influence, has pressure, and they are continually exercising that pressure, which gives hope for people, and that this influence might make the Taliban to soften their policies. And the last point, I think, in my view, in the study that I did, or the people I have lived with in Afghanistan, particularly in Western Afghanistan, there will be, whether you do something or you don't do something from outside, there are people there. They are a strong woman, and there are some men who are able to change themselves. And I think they are the biggest hope for doing something from within Afghanistan.
Thank you, Reza. We are nearing the end of our time, so I would like to give the floor to Syed Akla and then to Shaharzad. If you can wrap up your comments. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. So if I summarize and list three things, I think, first of all, we have to give hope to these people. So they are right now hopeless. In some way, we have to tell them that our politicians, Western politicians, don't represent Western values, and like that, human rights, women's rights, democracy, and all of them. So people in Afghanistan right now, particularly women, are hopeless, and we need to give them hope, and because they are hopeless with regard to politicians, so we have to show we are different than our politicians. Second, we put pressure on our politicians in some way. I don't know, for maybe conferences, maybe some publications, public letters, doing a petition, anything like that, to show in some way we are different than them, we're giving hope to them, and they are not forgotten. So that's a very fear that right now Afghan women are suffering. They think because of the new things in the world, they are forgotten. And finally, I think we have to give them the concept that they deserve our support. In some way, unfortunately, politicians gave this kind of the idea that Afghanistan is a country cannot be united. They are radical, they are racial, they are xenophobic, anything like that. And unfortunately, a lot of people are reflecting this kind of the ideas, and we have to fight against it. And we have to acknowledge, as Palwasha told us, so that in Afghanistan, actually, people are very welcoming to the foreigners, and there is not real things like tribalism or racism in Afghanistan, or radicalism is not part of Afghan culture. It's just my last point is that when I'm comparing my generation to the my father generation and my grandfather generation, I just see that generation after generation become more radical. My father was less radical than my generation, and my grandfathers, as I hear their stories, grandmothers, they were much less radical. So that's not the what we think of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Akbar. Shaharzad, can you just be
I'll try to keep it brief, yes. The first thing is, I think, very important to remember, don't forget Afghanistan. Everyone said this, because the problems of Afghanistan don't remain in Afghanistan. The second thing is, in engaging with Afghanistan, be conscious and recognize the diversity of Afghanistan. The diversity, if you're talking to everyone that you're talking to is saying the same thing, maybe something is missing. So you have to recognize that Taliban are not the only reality. We are not only the only reality. It's a very diverse and complex reality, and kind of really be conscious of that. And the third thing, one of the areas in which investments really paid off in Afghanistan was education. So I'm going to also echo Pashtana's recommendations on continuing to invest on Afghan's education, Afghan women's education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaharzad, for your final comments. I would like to now end by thanking our audience and our hosts for joining and for organizing this very important and timely event. As all of our speakers mentioned, there is an ongoing crisis, a big humanitarian crisis, which also involves a crisis in women and gender rights in Afghanistan, and we don't have the luxury to turn away our heads from what's going on over there.